in March describing the plans of the Kaiserschlacht, the actual offensive as it was properly conceived and directed by Ludendorff. We observed what were, from the German side, the false, major strategic question mark regarding the same plan. In fact, the same German command had doubted, regardless of Ludendorff's direction, concerning especially the lack of a proper and ultimate objective, like a strong position to seize as a cornerstone for further operations. Essentially, Ludendorff had concentrated just on the idea of the breakthrough, right? And as it did happen, as we will see also today, the main issue that is an amplification, given also the success of the initial onslaught of the typical World War I issues from a strategical, logistical point of view. There is an enormous effort, an enormous expense to break through, but it's difficult to progress. The supply lines get increasingly stretched, and if you don't really have an ultimate place to anchor yourself, even an ultimate, again, idea of what direction the various armies participating to the offensive will take, which was in fact something decided in theory and also against, in part, again, the ideas of the same commanders on the field that would have liked like a continuous pursuit, for example, the 5th British Army, not much of widening of the same gap between the British and the French. It wouldn't really have a specific ending point, and the hope naturally was that the enemy forces would have melted away, that the British would have embarked, crossed back the channel, the French gradually at that point given up their positions. Consider that, as we've seen in the first part of the video, the Germans arrived thanks to their monster artillery reach to basically 100 kilometers from Paris that came again under fire. There was, however, this major issue that even though the Germans did manage to break through, a bit like at Verdun that we described, immediately, like the battleground of reports began to stress the fact that the enemy resistance was increasingly hard, and that the second phase, like the attritional one of injecting further reserves to push after the initial breakthrough to further consolidate positions, was causing gruesome casualties. Today we will see the question mostly from the Allied side, right? And we will have a last video about the ultimate end and the aftermath, the consequences. Naturally, I plan to cover every single battle of World War I, like for any war, in some depth, right? So the Kaiserschlacht is the first one that I do, at least as a major, of course, military operation, and it would deserve many more videos for the smaller battles within it. If anything, especially a tactical analysis of typical World War I clashes, even though, of course, there would be some greater characterization for anything across the years. But as I always say, it's important to start with a bigger picture than getting in the depths of it. Otherwise, you couldn't contextualize the smaller engagements as well. Some are very fascinating, but again, it's important to properly understand where they came from, also from in a broader strategical logic. We look at the Allies that were, of course, freaking out because the main deal of World War I, as you know, especially on the Western Front, was this stalemate that by the beginning of the Kaiserschlacht had entered in its 4th year, and that, in fact, did seem to approach an end of the war that, however, could still be played on. I mean, the end was obvious in the sense that resources were limited. The Kaiserschlacht in many ways was basically it would be the last German chance. The Italian front at the same time is quite interesting after Caporetto up to the Battle of the Solstice. You know that the same Kaiserschlacht lasted up to July. Then there is the last Allied push from August to November towards Germany, whose lines had began to falter after this major and failed effort. However, this is exactly the point. The Germans were going for it, and as we've seen, again, there is a similarity with the Battle of Verdun, because this was the German side of the story. They had important means at their disposal, very strong artillery, a clever doctrine in that sense, as far as fire concentration, and just even with the stretched resources that they had at home, like the home front was basically, as you know, closed. The Allies had the upper hand on the intercontinental trade routes, access to the sea. Germany was gradually reducing its internal resources. So this operation was very heavily concerted. The Germans had also, differently from the Allies that had experimented armored warfare to a large, also mechanized armored warfare to a large degree. At Amiens, the results had been evidently scarce, right? There was an increased chance to think that this war could be resolved doctrinally, but at least armored warfare wasn't actually to be that till well after the end of the war. And the Germans on their side were to experiment a more exquisitely tactical solution through the Stoßtruppen that actually all armies at this point had, and that had already been experimented also in different theaters by also powers that we don't consider more than much for that, but the Germans had objectively maximized their effectiveness. They had been tested in the aforementioned Caporetto, for example, and there was a general trust, like a confidence in the German forces, in these troops for their general success and the possibility to break through the Western Front, and then pouring in reserves like crazy and hoping properly to knock out both Britain and France out of the war. Naturally, I'm not going to skip any further consideration regarding the political end of this, meaning that the Germans, since their failed Marne offensive in 1914, knew that they could win on the battlefield, but that the war was fundamentally lost in a broader sense. They could just hope through this very strong shoulder push to get some sort of mild terms in a balanced situation, even though this is just speculative. I'm not going to enter into it. Surely, however, the collapse of the British-French front would have been a major disaster for the entire Allied enterprise, and their very interesting strategical scenarios could have opened. But that's not what is going to happen. In the moment, however, so we also studied this from a strictly operational point of view. There is this initial phase. It's just like at the Verdun, in which you concentrate forces and you really break through, right? You have the best forces available, the greatest power, thus. And so if in the very first days, basically, if the thing succeeds, there are good chances for through the injection of reserves for this offensive at least to prolong itself for months through an attritional phase that should have basically capitalized upon, like hopefully odds hopefully increasingly tilting towards, in this case, the German offensive at the detriment of the British-French defensive. There are lots of question marks, again, politically and militarily, like, I don't know, the increasing American element injected in the Allied forces in general, just in the Western Front. But at large, indeed, in this first shock that the Germans managed to inflict to the British and the French, things seemed like faltering. Like, the Germans immediately understood that they hadn't fully managed to basically just destroy the enemy front in the first days. Just now they had to push further. And at that point, of course, the British and the French that had managed to maintain control of the situation, regardless of the fact that they abandoned important positions, they were essentially, it was a German wedge that was increasingly penetrating the the conjunction between the British and the French forces. They had, been targeted properly with the purpose of splitting them, was to contain the German breakthrough. Right, you usually have the spearhead and then all the injection of forces that would have kept on fighting in attrition in Europe. So in this strategic analysis, we naturally observe how balanced the odds were. So we've seen from the German side sort of the bad things happening. Today we see from the British and the French side the bad things happening, because this is such a chaotic moment that while there is a logic to it, you can't really in the moment, especially from an emotional, a moral point of view, really understand whether you're going to make it or not. Because it's such a stretched situation for both sides that it's the culminating point of the offensive. And generally speaking, of course, the more time passes, the more you can understand how tendentially things are going to go. Right? So on March 24th, the French General Pétain notified Haig, the British, these were the commanders in charge of the respective of the British and the French chunk Western Front, that he might need to direct the French Third Army to break away from the heavily damaged British right flank that had been essentially the greatest target of the Germans, in as much as an engine that would have caused a greater problem, the more qualitative side, right? Attacking the French could have been somehow easier at the wall, but then you would have had the British on the flank threatening them. That was the most important force. Like the Germans were specifically aiming at knocking that, at least primarily, out of the game. So basically, Pétain told Haig that he would have taken his French Third Army back to safeguard Paris, that, as we've seen, had come to be under greater pressure and even properly German artillery range. Pétain privately convinced that Haig planned to withdraw to the Channel ports and forsake the French himself, was essentially suggesting to the British commander-in-chief a reciprocal abandonment of the Allies' commitment. This is serious, right? Because you see how even personal factors can interplay. Like Haig was profoundly disturbed by this, but of course, nor him and Pétain simply bailed out of the game. The problem is, of course, how the situation was granularly evolving on the field. Naturally, the cause of this abrupt crisis was the lack of a real supreme commander with authority over all Allied forces. There was a great problem. Like Britain and France were, of course, major players in the war, and they couldn't simply be told by others what to do. Right? We've seen in the video about the Battle of the Altipiani that after that Strafexpedition, which was actually never termed like that by the Austrians. However, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had lost its operational autonomy. Right? They fell under the German Empire that led the broader force. While France was properly the country that did not have to fall, and so that was of course helped by the British, the various allies, as you know, that at this point were also joining the war themselves, also later in time. But since that was properly their own country, they had also political leverage on the same allies, right? They couldn't simply take over France in the midst of the struggle with the Germans. France also was, of course, standing on her feet. Still, at this point, they had major industrial bases. They had their own demographic resources, so they were fully into the fray, and they were not to simply be commanded. While Supreme War Council under the leadership of French General Foch had been formed months earlier, it served mainly as an advisory group of some sort, so an assembly of peers, and they would essentially still go their own autonomous way. Both Haig and Pétain had actively ensured, by the way, this Supreme War Council to remain limited to that role, because they knew that there was no political rather than a strategic way to simply unify command of the Allied forces. However, Haig now understood that there was only one viable solution, and he took action. On March the 26th, the Supreme War Council gathered in Doullens, where Haig stated, quote, "If General Foch will consent to give me his advice, I will gladly follow it." As a result, the fiercely determined Foch was named coordinator of the Anglo-French forces around Amiens. Essentially, the British made this gracious favor to the French, saying, well, okay, you are the ones risking collapse of your own country. At least Britain has the Channel as a huge moat defending itself. We have to safeguard the integrity of France. Tell us what to do, and of course, still within our own our autonomy, we will provide, right? And so, within a week, Foch was appointed commander-in-chief of all Allied armies on the Western Front. So this speaks, of course, of the gravity of the situation and this universal strategic principle of unity of command that, as we were just talking about yesterday regarding the Roman Concordia Ordinum, emerges properly in the Metus Hostilis, in this moment of greatest threat, external threat and common interest. Concurrently, Ludendorff was striving to revive his weakening offensive. Right, the Germans have their own problems on their side. At this point, the British and the French had halted, again, the major breakthrough, but their resources were not infinite, and the Germans were throwing in their very best. From the latter side, indeed, like, that's the problem. You're basically witnessing, just out of a simple mathematical calculation, how much time is left before you can break through, and especially, you know, what the losses are going to mean in terms of how to maintain the front's stability in the event of a failure, which is in fact what the Germans will never quite recover from after this, if not, in the moment of the various, again, stopping points during withdrawal. Being this was the commander of the Fifth Army, had been pushed out of Flesquières. Also, Bapaume had been captured by the Germans. However, the advance towards the northwest had largely ground to a halt. Right. Last time, if you remember, basically Ludendorff had decided to use his three armies to basically open this gap, right? To basically press north one toward the French, in south toward the British, in the south towards the French, and basically distract even some German forces were successfully pushing the southernmost part of the British forces back, right? This was opposed again by the same subordinates, who instead said, like, if you could knock that entire army out, there's going to be actually also a bigger breakthrough. Yes, they may have been exposed on the flanks, but in the moment, like, the balance of these two options still held pretty tightly. So what happened in a bit more detail is that General Julian Byng's British Third Army, Fifth Army, was driven out of the heavily fortified Flesquières salient. We are on March the 23rd, with the German stormtroopers under General Georg von der Marwitz's Second Army overwhelming British defenses through intense artillery barrages and infiltration tactics. On March the 24th, von der Marwitz's forces captured the strategic town of Bapaume after fierce street fighting, securing a key position on the Somme front. Despite these gains, the German push northwest towards Arras and Amiens faltered by March the 25th. So you understand even how relatively brief these things were and how attrition kicked in into, again, more sort of static positions already. Byng's Third Army, bolstered by the New Zealand Division and the 19th and 40th British Division, mounted stubborn counterattacks, reclaiming small pockets like Loupart Wood and holding defensive lines at Heninel and Monchy-le-Preux. German infantry, exhausted and depleted by heavy casualties, struggled to advance further as British artillery and machine gun fire from entrenched position disrupted their momentum. The German 17th Army under Otto von Bellov, targeting St. Paul, was bogged down in costly assaults against fortified British strongpoints while supply lines stretched thin, leaving troops short of ammo and rations. By March the 28th, the northwest advance had ground to a near standstill, with German forces unable to break through the reorganizing British defenses. So, to regain momentum, Ludendorff assembled the remaining fresh units for Operation Mars. That was part of a list. We've seen it in the previous video of different operations, of different options, mostly in the direction of the attack that the Germans had preventivated, depending on how the front would have developed during the offensive. And in fact, on the same March the 28th, he initiated a direct attack on Arras. Operation Mars revealed the shortcomings of infiltration tactics, right? Because again, as I said before, and also in other videos, there was not really a tactical solution to trench warfare during World War I, right? Not even in the end. The 9 German divisions involved, without fog to conceal their movements and facing 4 well-fortified British divisions, found no weaknesses to exploit. The attackers suffered heavy losses, and Ludendorff prudently called off the same Operation Mars on the same 28th. Right? This tells you also we'll see at the end the amount of losses in general, but how quickly, the immediacy of the losses, right? Hadn't the Germans lost so many troops in these attacks, like the magnitude of the operation would have not actually brought to that immediate halt, right? But it's definitely fascinating to see also how tightly controlled the immediate information coming from the front lines really was. In the general disorder, you didn't really know where all units were at all time, right? Not even the defenders had. You can imagine the attackers. So in a more detailed way, let's say that this deadlock of the German spring offensive was attemptably broken through the launch of Operation Mars, right, which targeted specifically the fortified British positions at Arras. Ludendorff, 9 divisions from the German 2nd and 17th armies, mustering fresh troops to exploit perceived weaknesses, or so at least what had not really been tested at that point. It could be seen as a viable option. Consider that in order to divert those forces against Arras, of course, the situation was pretty difficult elsewhere. And so once you had directed against that objective, you would have lost, in case of failure, even more momentum. So this gives you a pretty graphic idea of what was going on at this point. The assault began at dawn, but without fog to mask their advance. The German infantry and stormtroopers were exposed to British reconnaissance. The Third Army's 4 divisions, entrenched with deep barbed wire belts, concrete strong points, and artillery zeroed on approach routes, repelled the attack. German units attempting infiltration tactics found no openings, though, as British machine gunners and riflemen cut down advancing waves. That is to say, by the way, it's not like Stoßtruppen and their tactics were just, the solution to everything at all points. Whatever, they worked if the situation allowed that, of course. The 18-pounder batteries delivered precise barrages on the advancing German forces. By midday, German casualties mounted rapidly, with some battalions losing over half their strength. This was being communicated to Ludendorff, who, recognizing the futility, cancelled Operation Mars that same evening, ordering surviving units to disengage from the bloodied Arras sector. Belatedly, Ludendorff ordered the 18th Army to push directly west towards Amiens, supported fully by the 2nd Army. However, at this point, Houthier's troops were exhausted and Allied defenses had become formidable. So basically, Ludendorff tried to bring more forces to reattempt this one of these minor offensives within the broader one. However, the defenders, of course, had an advantage to spend, and the hardening of their fortifications played an important role in all this. That's why overall the assault petered out. On April the 5th, Ludendorff ended Operation Michael. That was essentially Ludendorff's brainchild and the larger of these lesser offensives within the Kaiserschlacht, the one that had properly begun the same. Right, so this was already a pretty grim indicator of the fact that the same commander-in-chief that had basically orchestrated the whole operation was basically calling off the most important spearhead of the war, right? And it was evident how this German desperate attempt to regain the initiative in the faltering spring offensive had been brutally cut short, right? It had begun with von Houthier's 18th Army thrusting west towards Amiens. That was also like a critical Allied rail hub, so it was really an important cornerstone. Here you see in the it was one at least of the main objectives that the Germans could have concentrated their effort on initially, but that was just part. It was subordinated to the separation of the British and the French. Any part, again, I'm not saying that they compare in scale, or that Amiens should have been the whole, objective of the Kaiserschlacht, but it could have started from there, like with some sort of more concrete directional attempt. And Georg von der Marwitz's Second Army was tasked to provide, if anything, flank support. The offensive, we're talking Michael, of course, here, had been launched on March the 30th and had witnessed the German infantry push across the scarred Somme battlefields, some along which the same Germans had to withdraw from the previous year. This facilitated, in a sense, their task, because also the British advanced positions were sort of weaker and they could be overwhelmed. Also, like passing like through that sort of between that point of conjunction between the two main army corps of the enemy was aimed to sever British supply lines, deteriorating the flank. Houthier's troops, however, were depleted from weeks of combat, their advance hampered by muddy terrain and broken supply chains, with artillery often stranded miles behind, really typical. Allied forces now under unified command, as we've seen with Foch, had fortified their positions with British 4th Army units, including the 1st Australian Division, digging in around Hebuterne and Albert, supported by French 1st Army troops. German assaults met fierce resistance, with British 18-pounder guns and Vickers machine guns. I made a video about, I mentioned, as I described them in the video about machine guns made recently, inflicting heavy losses, especially near Morlancourt. So by April the 4th, the German push had stalled at Villers-Bretonneux, where Australian counterattacks reclaimed key ground. Right. So on April the 5th, Ludendorff halted Operation Michael as German forces, exhausted and unable to breach the strengthened Allied line, literally fell back. Right. So if you look at this, by the way, you realize of the staggering. So this is just the first phase, right? And the losses can already be counted to a striking degree. The British incurred 160,000 casualties, including 90,000 taken as prisoners. So we're talking here from probably the beginning of the offensive, because as you understood, Michael was essentially that spearhead that had initially succeeded in overrunning a great deal of British positions, and even having the Third Army withdrawing substantially from its positions, while the French lost an additional 70,000, which tells you also, again, how the Germans had prioritized the British sector was deemed to be more worrying for them. In their view, they would have disposed of the French later. German casualties were nearly as high. In return, the Germans seized 1,800 square kilometers of ravaged French territory, extending their front line by another 75 kilometers, but not encompassing more than much within those. In fact, no strategic goals were accomplished. During the battle, the number of US combat troops in France doubled. So we're talking a few weeks. But this is where the British and the French were pressing the Americans like crazy for more and more troops. In fact, the US forces rose from 162,000 to 318,000. You understand also why the Germans were in a hurry to make a significant breakthrough into the Allies' line, because the American manpower at that point would have become overwhelming for any positive attempt of breakthrough for the rest of the war. And so this is really insane, right? The campaign's cost was really staggering. British losses included, and this is just the beginning, all right, of the Kaiserschlacht as a whole, but for telling you properly how traumatic these offensives could be in their very beginning, where most of the war was to be decided. British losses included 75,000 captured at Bapaume and elsewhere, while the French casualties mounted in secondary sectors. German losses were equally severe, with, as we've seen, entire battalions decimated. The territorial gain of the Germans, again, yielded them no strategic advantage, as especially Amiens remained in Allied hands. And this is really, again, what Ludendorff had to deal with now, because we have seen it well in the first episode, but Germany's entire fortunes on a decisive offensive in the West. And by all indicators available, now this was going to fail. In all likelihood, it was not fully over, but the premises for a major breakthrough yielding substantial strategic results at the regional level was not there. When Operation Michael failed to achieve a breakthrough, Ludendorff redirected his efforts to an attack in Flanders, because the conviction was that if at this point the British and the French could not be divided, and so causing a major collapse of the entire, especially the British willpower through that aforementioned wedge, like the British presence could have been significantly weakened in Flanders, that also hosted the ports through which the British resupplied their army. And in fact, if you remember in the first video, we explained how Haig was in general worried mostly for that, right? Which would have been another way to go, trying to properly bottle the same British armies on the continent by cutting off their supplies, and that would have been really also a big problem. Naturally, due to, you understand, even just strategically speaking, once you have concentrated this major effort to just one point, at this point, any other effort in another direction is going to be pretty limited. There were some German forces predisposed along the front near to the sea to carry out what disinfect operations were already named for. There was actually a transformation of the term from Saint-Georg to Saint-Georgette, due to the diminished forces of the Germans had displayed some incredibly unusual humor in this dramatic circumstances. Sort of tells it all. Only 11 fresh divisions, in fact, were available at that point for such trust in Flanders. 2 armies, 4th and the 6th, were to strike along an 18-kilometer front between La Bassée and Armentières, targeting the vital British supply at Hazebrouck. With their critical supply ports directly behind them, the British were at least forced to hold their ground and fight there. And again, it's not like this operation was doomed to fail since the beginning, but we'll see now what happened. It was definitely a fallback plan for the Germans that realized that was maybe the only other viable thing to do in that moment. In Flanders, 3 Allied armies were deployed. The Belgian army held the northernmost 27 kilometers of the front, doggedly defending a narrow strip of their own homeland, as a matter of fact, regardless of the fact that their country had been knocked out by the Germans, was largely under occupation. The British Second Army, led by the highly skilled General Plumer, extended south to the River Lys. We have medieval warfare memories around these places, by the way. General Sir Henry Horne's First Army was positioned from Armentières south to Vimy. Both British armies had been drained of units to counter Operation Michel, and many of the divisions recently returned had been severely battered on the Somme. So these were definitely not full strength and fresh divisions. Nevertheless, the Germans were also a bit scraping the bottom of the barrel. Horne's army was not entirely British, by the way. Southeast of Neuve-Chapelle, the Portuguese corps held the line. Like Gaff the previous month, Horne had insufficient troops to cover a wide front and, despite concerns about Portuguese morale, lacked the resources to replace them. Right? The reason why the Germans had broken through, as we've seen especially had broken specifically the southernmost British sectors, that in part forces were really stretched out, considering the might of the Germans, and that's why, again, the insistence on the American troops here is crucial. And equally, there was this problem in the north with, as you understand here, other nationalities interspersed in the British forces. On April the 5th, when the Portuguese 1st Division was pulled back to the rear, no substitute unit was provided, which is a big problem, as you understand. And this compelled essentially the Portuguese 2nd Division to stretch its line northward for making up for that sector of the front. It was really not good. Horne planned to relieve the 2nd Division within 4 days. But on April the 9th, so basically on that 4th day, the Germans launched Operation Georgette. This means that the Portuguese there were in trouble, and so were the British as a consequence. The offensive opened with a ferocious hurricane bombardment. The Germans had really been habituated to this, and this was well orchestrated by Bruch-Müller, who had been dispatched north with his heavy artillery to provide with that preparatory fire. Under the cover of thick morning mist, the Germans tended to exploit this for their Stoßtruppen incursions. 9 divisions of the 6th Army attacked the Portuguese corps, which at that point collapsed and fled. By nightfall, the Germans had advanced 8 kilometers along a 9-kilometer front, reaching the banks of the Lys. On April the 10th, the German 4th Army widened the offensive, striking the right flank of the British 2nd Army north of Armentières. Plumer's troops gave ground reluctantly, inflicting heavy casualties on their attackers. Nevertheless, by nightfall, Armentières had fallen to the Germans, and the British were running out of space to retreat. Right, so this was actually a pretty disastrous beginning. Gas, high explosive shells on the Portuguese that had low morale, they were seen overstretched, they didn't have solid fortifications, overrun. The Germans advanced. The couple of British divisions basically dug in with their machine guns supported by artillery fire. They're a tough nut to crack, but they did crack in the end. And the Germans were really swarming through. In fact, the next day, on April the 11th, the Messang Ridge was captured by the Germans. This ridge was a key defensive position held by the same General Herbert Plumer's British Second Army. It had been subjected to a punishing artillery bombardment at dawn, with German heavy guns, expertly coordinated by Colonel Georg Bruch-Müller, once again saturating British trenches and wire defenses. Under cover of lingering morning mist, German infantry, including elements of the 9th Bavarian Reserve Division, launched a fierce assault, engaging in close quarters combat with British defenders from the 36th, Ulster, and 16th Irish Divisions. Outnumbered and battered by the intense barrage, the British troops fought tenaciously, inflicting significant casualties with machine gun fire and bayonet charges. However, by late afternoon, German numerical superiority and relentless pressure overwhelmed the defenders, forcing a withdrawal. The Germans seized Messin Ridge, gaining a commanding view over the Ypres salient and further tightening their grip on the collapsing Allied line. So this was yet another nearly complete German success. The situation was pretty dramatic for the Allies. On April the 12th, with his reserves depleted, Haig himself issued a daily order that sounded something like this, quote, "There is no other course open to us but to fight it out. Every position must be held to the last man. There must be no retirement. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one must fight to the end." Now, you understand what that means, especially if you are the average Tommy, right, out there in the chaos of battle, right? This is really the deal, right? Either you stand and win or die in the enterprise, right? And it's unlikely, by the way, that amidst the tumult of battle, this order of Haig's reached all troops on the front line, right? The reactions must have morally been really interesting. There are probably many of the British fighting there were already aware by themselves of the situation, judging from the intensity of combat, and they probably didn't even have time just to hear this speech, this issue. It was one of the critical moments of the Kaiserschlacht. This may have, again, gone better. This was an option since the beginning. Had it been really exploited, there might have been a very interesting alternative scenario. In any case, it's not like the Germans, as we've seen, were simply pouring through, right? And they were taking staggering losses. Ludendorff, in fact, was already frustrated even with Georgette's progress. German morale was, by the way, at this point significantly lower than at the beginning of Unternehmen Michel, and discipline was deteriorating fast, right? These troops, there's so much that just a unit can do in this incredibly pressuring circumstances. The German advance was frequently stalled as starving soldiers posed to plunder captured British supplies. Remember what we said in the first episode, the German propaganda at home was bombarding the soldiers with the notion that basically the Allies were starving, that the Germans were just a step away from victory, etc. Instead, first of all, the German troops were suffering scarce supplies, probably because of the poverty of the home front. There had been major famines in Germany. People were dying on the street. Regardless of the Allies' shortcomings that we are illustrating, when the Germans stormed even the first lines of British defenses, instead found their canteens replete with food, at least, with way more food than, first of all, than them, and especially much plentier than what their national propaganda had stated, thus probably impacting them from a psychological point of view much harder than we can imagine in that regard. Imagine this after 4 years of World War I, right? Despite initial success in targeting the weakest section of Horn's front, the German 6th Army was making little headway towards Azebuk. As British defenses strengthened, Ludendorff shifted his focus farther north, where the low hill of Mount Kemmel loomed over the flat landscape. However, the Fourth Army's attempts to capture Kemmel were also largely unsuccessful. When his staff proposed expanding the offensive to include a direct assault on the British salient around Ypres, Ludendorff quickly agreed. So it's just like banging your head continuously against the umpteenth obstacle and trying to find a different way through defenses that are continuously hardening while your offensive is increasingly weakening. We are at this point by mid-April, as Operation Georgette pressed the British lines. General Herbert Plumer, commanding the left wing of the First Army, anticipated the German Fourth Army's next move under General Ferdinand von Quast. The Passchendaele Ridge, bitterly won in 1917 at a horrific cost in British lives, the Canadians, where I've been asked to make a video specifically about that, and we'll see. 1917 was one of the most atrocious, of course, years of the war. That, also the other years weren't that tender, so to say, but we're talking still about a pretty significant episode here that would pass down for brutality on top of the average brutality of World War I. Offered little strategic value despite its hard-earned significance. And think about this also from a psychological point of view. When these battles were fought, the battlefields themselves were often had often been the theater of previous engagements. Some very famous ones. Also from a psychological point of view, to see terrain changing, right? That way, of course, it was understood also from the average soldier that it was about the guys on the ground that mattered, that turned that battlefield into that mess, right? But it's at the same time psychologically devastating to think how you would fight for every inch of that very ground for eventually seeing it with nobody on it months later. Actually, of course, witnessing the traces, right, the memories of that horrifying the battle, but now being devoid of any meaning. It's as if your entire fort had been somehow useless, right? So displaying decisive foresight, Plumer ordered at this dedicated point a tactical withdrawal from the exposed Passchendaele sector on April the 15th to 16th, pulling back his forces, including the 9th Scottish and the 49th West Riding Divisions, to a more defensible line. This retreat secured Ypres while collapsing the vulnerable salient, forcing German troops to advance across 3 kilometers of treacherous, shell-poked terrain, mired in mud and swept by British artillery fire from newly entrenched positions, plus the ones that they could essentially shoot up to that range, which naturally was closer to the further in-depth British defenses that, as we've seen, weren't really that much, telling the truth, at the beginning of the Kaiserschlacht, but that overall at that point could be, at least with the advantage of internal lines of the defender, be positioned for that, in fact, defensive purpose. Thwarted by this unexpected maneuver, the Germans shifted their offensive northward on April the 17th, targeting the Belgian lines near Merkem. The Belgians, reinforced by French artillery and infantry, met the assault with fierce resistance, unleashing devastating barrages and holding their ground, repelling Quast's forces with heavy casualties and stalling their advance. You understand what happened. Essentially, Unternehmen Georgette had deteriorated into another war of attrition, with the outcome still uncertain. Haig was risking his manpower as Georgette was steadily wearing down the British army as well, not just the German one. So remember, this is not just a situation where the Germans are simply running around trying to break through. There is, of course, a uniform, more or less uniform front where everybody's fighting against everybody. Yes, it's not the action is not happening uniformly everywhere at the same time, but the pressure, especially think about artillery, regardless of infantry assaults, etc., is scattered pretty much all over, and significant action is witnessed pretty much all across the line. Also, the Germans are still committing their reserves, so this thing, as we will see, will go on for months, right? But this was essentially the moment in which the Germans would have had to essentially break through to have an entire army corps collapse, and it did not happen. Simultaneously, a separate issue was emerging between Haig and Foch. Haig was dismayed to discover that the new Allied commander was as hesitant as Pétain to deploy large numbers of French troops to support the British. Right, this was a very cynical consideration, but the French were also wary of the fact that the Germans could have at some point turned their forces against them. Both Pétain and Foch agreed on the necessity of maintaining a significant reserve, especially behind the French front, right, and not to therefore endanger like the line, thinking that if the Germans broke through there, there would be really nobody that could have come to their help. Both Pétain and Foch, as we've seen, probably thought that the British were not even just too necessarily interested in helping the French, and so that they cared mostly about their position. And so they committed to this attitude, which was cautious. By the way, Pétain feared a new German offensive. Foch was already preserving reserves for a future Allied counteroffensive as well. So there was an interesting difference as well in the motivation behind this. Pétain was really just more cautious because he thought, like, if the Germans again turn against us, it's going to be a problem. Foch was along that line, but he was also thinking essentially like, this stuff has turned against the British mostly, and if anything, like, they probably started realizing at this point the Germans weren't quite simply breaking through, or they strongly hoped so at the same time. And so at that point, a counteroffensive was to be launched, and of course the retention of fresh French forces would have helped making the French gain prominence in this future counteroffensive that would have actually been the last of the war, and so one that would have allowed the French to sit at the table of negotiations with more strength, at least behind the face. That of course would have always been maintained given the role of France in all of this. This is particularly important. But of course, to the British that were taking almost the full brunt of the German offensive, at this point it didn't really seem relevant. The French seemed to be sitting out the war while the British fought for their survival, and the situation, as we've seen, was pretty serious. In any case, in late April, Operation Georgette faltered. So General Ferdinand Foch dispatched 5 French divisions to reinforce General Herbert Plumer's beleaguered British Second Army in Ypres, the sector of Ypres. This tells you that anyhow the French at the end of the day did help the British, but only after sort of the most intense situation was over. This is interesting because again it's not a particularly long time, but of course the situation in as we've seen in from the British side was confused and difficult enough that the French thought that basically sending troops at that moment would have not really been determinant, right? If anything, they needed reassurances that the British lines were stabilizing, that the Germans basically were running out of steam to go reinforce the British. And therefore, at that point, remember, there is always also a political reason behind such behavior. On April the 25th, two of these French divisions were holding Mount Kemmel, a critical high ground, as we've seen, south of Ypres, when General 6th von Armin's German 6th Army renewed its assault with a fierce artillery bombardment followed by a swift infantry advance. So again, the Germans were still sending shock waves, and the French themselves found themselves there in the north, witnessing that. To Field Marshal Douglas Haig's dismay, the French troops, shaken by weeks of relentless fighting, because this had happened also from their side, however, crumbled under the onslaught, and German forces, including the elite Alpenkorps unit, overran the hill in a mere 3 hours, steering a 6-kilometer breach into the Allied line. This is savage. It tells you how desperate the same Germans were to really go for it with all their forces, and causing this massive debacle in certain sections of the Allied line. This also shows, by the way, that probably the French concerns regarding the possibility of their front to hold in case of this kind of German offensives eventually possibly turning against them, were valid. They probably thought that their troops were not ready at that point to get like the full might of this strikes. By the way, the aforementioned gap left the path to the Channel coast dangerously exposed. Yet, General Ludendorff, rigidly controlling the offensive scope, had restricted the German objective to capturing Mount Kemmel. This is interesting as well, because we've seen Ludendorff was also a very energetic person. He surely had a very sound belief in his strategic principles, but here he seems to have lacked some general flexibility regarding the various opportunities that arose in front of him. You see, like when we talk about the myth of the butchers in general, people just think about, again, we explained how that superstition started, but if errors as they are made in war actually happen at this point, it was not because, I don't know, men were thrown against fortified positions that could be defended with machine guns, etc. We explained how, especially the biggest engagements, are, nullifying or at least leveling that disadvantage. If you look at major offensives during the war, it's not like, I don't know, because machine guns existed in World War I, there were, 100,000 dead from one side and 3 million from the side of the offender. But we see here something different, where to attack exactly. Like the considerations are not really very difficult to make at that point. By the way, we study this. We're not even trying, as I was saying before, to offer some deeper explanation based on the actual primary sources, because studying battles like this requires a lifetime, right? But of course, we know the stuff from, of course, histories that were written at the time and that were fair companion, also people who were there and in positions of command that roughly understood what was going on, right? They felt that, right? They checked the strategic pulse, right? In any case, it's difficult to say why Ludendorff did not specifically exploit the crumbling of that sector held by the French. It's not like it would have necessarily solved the Kaiserschlacht, but it may have opened new opportunities for the Germans to exploit and improve their situation, right? Instead, again, that no orders were issued to exploit that breakthrough. Instead, the British understood the advantage was offered at that point. They seized the opportunity, and their forces, including elements of the 21st and 39th Divisions, rapidly moved to seal the breach with fresh entrenchments and artillery support stabilizing the line by April the 26th. Again, it's not like there weren't Germans fighting there, but they were not reinforced with enough troops to carry on like the advance, because all this front again was moving, was active, was hot, right? And so imagine just this is what indeed may seem grotesque to a degree, that the fact that the hopes and prayers of hundreds and thousands of men in particular sectors of the front were basically annihilated together with their lives by a simple like, okay, well, here we don't see an opportunity, let's concentrate somewhere else, is pretty crude, right? It does really make you imagine also the moral impact on the same fighting forces and how complex. Not like the German or the Allied High Command did not realize this. On the contrary, we've seen that the French were pretty cautious, that the British were definitely bitten by the German assaults. But naturally, the Germans had the initiative here, had the upper hand, the positive object, and they basically at least failed not just in the broader operation, so at the root of the whole philosophy, so to say, but they also did not exploit specific opportunities that ex post, especially, we can say, look, this didn't happen, but at the time, naturally, would have been very complicated to simply assess, consider how communications could work, how could reports, with really the means of the time, like how even just a particular perception would influence, maybe as a misconception, as an error, a mistake, or a simple impression, the judgment of the same commanders. And it's not, again, like the troops knew better, other than paying for the consequences of this, or maybe, also earning something, as we've seen in this case from the British side. On April the 29th, the Germans launched a final desperate push, but Plumer's reinforced troops, now bolstered by French reserves and British artillery, repelled the attack with disciplined fire and counter-charges, inflicting heavy losses and halting the German advance. This point was very momentous because it basically marks the turning of the tides, or at least the culminating point of the German offensive, and the fact that the British, the French have taken this very heavy blow, but have the moral and material forces to counterattack and stop, in fact, the German advance by killing really lots of enemies in the process as well. So it's very moral. It's very interesting, of course, to study a war through this kind of also pulse checking in terms of the quality of this or that unit, on the basis also of their moral strength, right? You can have the same unit perfectly equipped, etc., but being battered, say, by a specific situation, or as we've just said, by a specific perspective, how things going on, and in fact underperforming, let's compare to what instead. And this often happens when, in fact, there are these, in the offensive and the defensive. We studied it in from Clausewitz, this back and forth, right? You see it there is a combination point, and then the enemy, if properly an advantage is being matured by the defensive, that is enough to counterattack, will pass to the counteroffensive as well. Naturally, here we're talking still the thing would go on for several weeks, But this is an instance where the Allies really managed to beat these attacks back. And in fact, this decisive rebuff marked the collapse of the same Operation Georgette, ending specifically the German threat in the Ypres sector that, as we've seen, had been particularly critical. This outcome built on Plumer's earlier strategic withdrawal from the Passchendaele salient on April the 15th to 16th, right? So remember that we've seen it in von Clausewitz, we've seen it recently also in the video about the war in Ukraine. It's not like, of course, like the defensive has an intrinsic advantage, should just seek for it without any, or at least just simply standing your ground no matter what, right? Giving ground at times as well can even be an effective mean to redeploy somewhere better. And in a way, as we've seen here, the stretched supply lines were a great problem for the Germans. It was true again throughout the entire World War I, because of the intrinsic limits of those armies that were otherwise, as you see also here, pretty effective overall. I mean, this was pretty good enough, let's say sometimes even clumsy and disorderly indeed, but still effective way of making war. And they're really incredible backs and forths. Foreseeing German intentions, by the way, Plumer had abandoned the blood-soaked ground of Passchendaele in 1917 to shorten his own lines as well, because it's the other advantage. That maneuver, executed with the 9th Scottish and 49th West Riding Divisions, had forced the German Fourth Army to slog through 3 kilometers of cratered mud, only, as we've seen, to be repulsed by Belgian and French forces near Merkem on April the 17th. Similarly, we've seen it with the loss of the Messin Ridge on April the 11th, where the German 6th Army's 9th Bavarian Reserve a division overwhelmed the 36th Ulster and 16th Irish divisions after brutal bombardment, exposing Ypres, but being mitigated exactly by the aforementioned Plumer's calculated retreat, which preserved at least his army's strength. Right, so you can have non-obvious things regarding, for example, who advances, who retreats, etc. Naturally, we were not just talking about a retreat, but controlled withdrawals, surely carried out in certain circumstances in pretty dire straits, but evidently, but still part of a broader logic. And again, with high spirits and good order, you can really do a lot, and the quality of troops, even in their basics, can be assessed also through this. So the rapid closure of the Mont Kemmel Gap and the defeat of the final German assaults underscored Plumer's tactical acumen, ensuring the Allies held firm against Ludendorff's waning offensive. Because this thing naturally had to conclude badly for the Germans, right? Today we looked essentially at that sort of still beginning. Again, we stopped last video looking at the very first days of the offensive that immediately, however, did not yield the results that had been hoped for, even though in Germany this was essentially presented as we won, the war is going to be over, naturally because also propaganda had largely pumped and hyped for this kind of expectation in the eve of the same operation, but from quite a long time, the preparation of it. And instead it was immediately understood also by the same Ludendorff. It's not like, again, the myth that, okay, let's simply go for it, we made a major disaster and we're not realizing what's going on. This was strategically a competent decision, also probably the only one that the Germans, and only them in that way, could mount up the way they did, right? But still, it wasn't enough, and some chances were lost. Indeed, there is a lot to discuss regarding the initial moves, the possibility of pressing further the British Third Army, of really going even more in depth, severing the further the British from the French, in or the possibility of attacking Flanders to sever the British, especially from their supply lines, seizing the ports, connecting them with Britain, etc. So all this were when Americans were starting to pour en masse, really, just hundreds of thousands landing in the span of a few weeks, as we've seen. So it's an incredibly dedicated, coincided moment, right? The second part we've seen today, in fact, is really the moment in which still the Germans had enough room for also exploiting their own internal lines to direct, because of course, as we've seen, the front itself was fairly compressed, and at the same time there were really lots of troops along it, so it's more like an attritional warfare. You have to, if anything, exploit. Imagine you have this major breakthrough and then you have to send in reserves to capitalize on that, right? So there are all these various minor operations that have been pre-planned in case things go wrong in various sectors. The Germans had calculated this, but even within this, they're not just they are failures, essentially, the enemy manages to hold up, etc. But even those situations in which the Germans successfully broke through the enemy lines weren't properly exploited, and they mostly suffered, if anything, from a broader, comprehensive vision of the front and where the forces lay, and what kind of expectations were to be derived from the breakthroughs themselves, and also against whom you really wanted to attack war, etc. Essentially, the Germans, especially in this phase, seem to have missed important opportunities, even though probably the major problem had started at the beginning when Ludendorff decided to split the main route of advance towards three different directions that ultimately may have instead, in fact, undermined the same, right? The more concentrated forces may have paradoxically probably sliced through the entire Allied front. And again, there's also the broader problem we pointed out at the beginning: where to exactly. And of course, like if you create a salient, then eventually your flanks are going to be exposed, etc. So these are all considerations that you don't really settle by stating, oh my god, they failed in the end, they must have made a mistake. No, in the moment, everything seemed feasible, right? And in fact, you understood here the British and French reaction. It's complicated. It's complicated, especially because it shows you how, after all, the Germans really had a tactical and strategic brilliance from their side, right? Especially their command, how the plan was devised, how the forces being put together, organization and everything. They had invested in their Stoßtruppen tactics. They had still their powerful artillery. By the end, let's say by this conclusive phase after 4 years of war, as they had experimented its use also elsewhere. So it's not like the Germans at large were so tactically elite in all. This is mass warfare. I've seen the Germans suffered also important supplies shortages in their own regard, etc. But this was really their last attempt to settle the war, and they went pretty close to that. Right, this is something which you could see also in other fronts. Again, we'll have to talk about the Battle of Solstice, and in fact, the various Entente Allied counteroffensives that eventually, through especially late summer and autumn of 1918, would basically bring to the collapse of the Central Power forces, and so reshaping the history of Europe in a very different situation. While we will look at the latter part of the Kaiserschlacht, and so also the grimmest aspect of it, also the final losses, etc. At the end of this phase, basically by the end of April, right? So after roughly a month that this had been going on, Haig could realize at least that it had been really a close call, right? The British army had, by the way, been severely depleted. Again, the Germans had identified in them the most important force to take out. 10 divisions had to be temporarily disbanded due to a shortage of manpower, which means probably that their cadres had been shattered to the impossibility of recompletion, which tells you a lot regarding probably the losses suffered by these troops. And we're talking, again, divisions. We're not talking of, companies. We're talking about the major chunks of some, at least down the line of strategic operations, like what really halt, as we've seen, this or that force concentration in critical sectors and so on. You can say, if anything, that from the Allied perspective, at this point, the worst was over. It's not like the following months would be particularly, pleasant. You understand that. Again, here, imagine down to the line, the combat goes on relentlessly. So casualties, not even just the concentration of single massacres in particularly concentrated encounters, which did happen, as we've seen today, especially on March the 28th, was really a battle blood from the German side. But, just even worse than that, like getting killed ultimately in the same way, but after having suffered for months of relentless combat, which is probably psychophysically torturous. But still something that these soldiers found the obvious reason to endure, till also very often that bitter end. Right? There are so many tragic stories, of course, behind this all. But it's quite interesting and important, of course, to document, in fact, the broader reason, the broader logic behind these clashes that are not evidently just some, as they show you on certain 21st century documentaries where there are just the two soldiers that meet from the two sides and they share the pictures of this. So these people actually wanted to kill one another the worst possible way, right? So let's stop with this fourth estate, completely made up nonsense that people fighting in this war were just, the martyrs, the victims of terrible elites. This is just a mental illness that developed as a concept, as a fantasy. After especially 1968, most people also self-citizen, self-styled conservatives that, basically babble about the same are just socialists, and they do not even understand that because, of course, they've not have a proper parenting, or obviously they've never even understood how just a few generations ago people had balls, as opposed to them. In any case, the staggering losses were also replenished, especially from the Allies' side, as 550,000 replacements were hurriedly dispatched to France from England, Italy, and the Middle East. This is very interesting because the Kaiserschlacht at that point had definitely impressed the whole world. This was really a massive German tail strike. If we can even just talk about tail strike, it was just going for it the most straightforward way. And the picture is really, really impressive. Again, the Americans are flowing in as well, so that is a major turning point in many in the balance of force. It can be said that although narrowly the Germans had once again been stopped, so that what had been experimented during the course of the war at large was practically reconfirmed in ways that seemed always tragically, familiar, right? Because aside from Wu won and Wu lost, the great deal of what we're just continuing to discuss, as you understand in these videos of World War I, was this apparent, it would be interesting to actually investigate in the perception of the soldiers at the time. This continuous frustration of the expectation of breakthrough, of decisiveness, of settling the matter. Surely it was very felt at the time. But I'm not convinced really that studying letters, diaries properly, that the most common sources of the time, we would actually hear, and even just from the officers, from people high in the hierarchy, an actual conviction that, say, an actual preeminence of this concept, right? This is mostly a narrative that I suspect we developed ex post the war, by stereotyping it in ways that naturally at the time had been acknowledged. And it's not like trench warfare was really, as you've seen also since the very beginning of the war, from the very first months, like something that the militaries of the world were to difficultly adapt to. Actually, trench warfare was an incredibly developed and sophisticated way of war. But let's say probably the notion that that would have been the most defining element of the war itself, it is wrong. It's probably something we developed ex post, mostly I would say in a technologistic framework. Right, it is true that surely Europe was coming from positivism. There was a great reliance, as we've seen, also with the Battle of Verdun. It wasn't actually bad strategically in line of principle, really. On, however, some sort of quasi-substitutive relation between the artillery in that case and probably the assaulting soldier. Actually, what you see is that, we've seen it in that battle, that the same soldiers down the line wanted to keep advancing, right, when the same generals called it off, because they realized that it was too much, that these soldiers were frustrated because they said, but we have come here to fight, to come to grip with the enemy. So also, again, the myth that these were people that were not fully into the cause, etc., is complete nonsense. But again, probably, and even in the ways, by the way, today we've seen a lot of, just even if you don't know literally anything historical about World War I, there have been famously enough, well, more than video games, let's say movies, right? Movies about World War I are just always the same identical thing. They never really show you something more dynamic, I don't know, street fight or fighting or something more open ground, or the actual distances that at times really existed across, no man's land, etc. But in general, at the time, the world, even visually, like in the arts, in the nascent movies, etc., was coming from a much more a perspective that was not really considering probably trench warfare just strictly per se. There were beautiful movies that were created, I don't know, even just 10 years later, about trench warfare. Some of the most realistic depictions, by the way, of the same, contrary to many modern movies of that. And yet, probably that war is how it was immortalized at the time, in the way it was eventually retold, and actually as properly portrayed in a way that today we can't fully associate it to how it really was, right? And unfortunately, like World War I veterans are not there anymore, but of course we have a lot of evidence that I think can be profitably studied exactly to highlight, perhaps again, the fair confidence that it existed at a time in a notion of making it, sort of breaking through it. So on. Again, this is the 10th video I made about World War I, and I'm very glad, because the playlist in itself hasn't been getting lots of views. It's fairly recent, by the way. It would also actually change the name, because I don't like World War I. It's like First World War to be better. Here today, while I was recording, I threw some water accidentally on on the mouse, and now it works badly, and I'm wasting a lot of time. But I hope this is going to get fixed. This is not something that concerns you. But every day there is something, right? This imagine during war, right? If our miserable lives in terms of complication or complexity seem like a big deal. Imagine what World War One, I don't know, in this heated phases of the Kaiserschlacht could be. What can go wrong, right? Will not always go wrong, but largely, like lots of things will go wrong. And probably from your perspective, it would look as if everything was going terribly wrong in that one. Here, have the damn mouse freezing. You don't even understand why it happens, because it's like on the pages it does, while on the, from a page to another it creates these issues. On the same page it doesn't. In any case, again, as you know, I've been expanding let's say contemporary warfare, telling the truth, altogether, and I've been fairly glad of this, because I thought that it was important for a channel like mine to expand on these different grounds. I don't know how much actually this satisfies the audience, because as you know, we've had a talk recently about how we're getting very weird sort of ratio in terms of watch length view. This is very strange. Like, at some very weird stats, while in the last several months, like, we had actually gotten very high. As Schwerpunkt had never really gotten before, and by a very high degree. And for some reason, instead, now we find this period of incredible lack of views, and I don't understand why, because the content is the same. So it's something inherent YouTube, and probably we discussed that, but I don't know. I keep making these videos, and I'm really thinking a lot about their proper practicality, their utility. We'll talk about this again, because I think it's an important topic that we should tackle together and just be honest about this all, because at this rhythm, right, without help, it's hard to go on, right? There's not monetary consideration or anything in particular, but just the motivation. Say I've come here to specifically talk about certain things, and I see that even though I'm at the highest of the subscribers of the videos of the, and I've come from this very high views for a consistently long time. A short time ago, everything collapses now, and I understand why that is the case. And so it's, at least in the moment, it's very downlifting, so to say, downbringing. But it's also something that maybe it's ups and downs are normal, but this seems to be something way more systemic and worrying and concerning. So this channel, YouTube has never been probably the best place to put, expectations. But at the same time, you really wonder why things go the way they go. And again, it's not easy to handle the wall, right? We'll see, really. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.